You are listening to WRFG Atlanta. WRFG provides a voice for those who have been traditionally denied open access to the broadcast media through the involvement of a broad base of community elements to guarantee that access. In the utilization of the facilities and its programs, the following communities will receive first priority: those who continue to be denied free and open access to the broadcast media, and those who suffer oppression or exploitation based upon class, race, sex, age, creed, disability, sexual orientation, or immigrant status.
My name is Heather Gray. The program is Just Peace, and I'm here with co-producer Ernest Dunkley. And this evening, I'm pleased to say we're going to be talking with Arun Kundnani. We're going to get some of his history here, but we are primarily going to be talking about his recent interview with Imam Jamil Al-Amin, who's in prison in Arizona. So, Arun, I want to thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Heather. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. So tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, actually. You're a writer, a researcher. Give us some background.
I grew up in Britain. When I was a lot younger, I became involved in various kinds of anti-racist politics in the UK. And there's a different history there compared to the United States around these questions. And we are shaped by the history of British colonialism and the struggles against it, as much as we are always also looking at the struggles in the United States. And so for us, involved in those kind of movements in the UK, we were always interested in the Black Power movement in the United States, the Black Panthers and so forth. Those of us like me who came up in those movements, we always read all of that history and all those books. And so that's how I became interested in writing about the story of Jamil Al-Amin, who was one of the major figures in the Black Power movement here.
In the Black Power movement in Britain, you're saying?
In the United States.
In the United States, right? Okay.
But he was someone that we had some awareness of in the UK. One of the things that we were doing was organizing ourselves as communities to defend ourselves against racist gangs, because especially a few decades ago, you simply weren't going to be protected from racist violence by the police. They were more likely to be perpetrators of it. Those of us who were involved in organizing in our communities back at that time, one of the issues that we were dealing with was racist violence, gangs of people who would go into Black neighborhoods or South Asian neighborhoods and carry out attacks. So people used to call it Paki bashing. Those of us from South Asian backgrounds were referred to as Pakis. That was the racist insult. And so
Paki as in Pakistan?
Right.
Where is your family from? I'm just curious.
My father is Sindhi, and Sindh is a part of Pakistan that is in the south of Pakistan. Like the city Karachi is the largest city in Sindh. And my father is someone who was made a refugee after the partition of India carried out by the British in 1947, as they ended their period of colonial rule. And as a result of that partition, 6 million people at least became refugees, and my father was one of those. And so since he was a teenager, he's never been back to Sindh. My mother is from Holland, and so I was born in London and grew up there.
I see.
So the history I'm trying to explain to your listeners involves communities of South Asians and African Caribbean communities in Britain organizing themselves to do self-defense against racist gangs. It's been in the kind of 70s and 80s especially. And so one of the important reference points for that was the Black movement in the United States, where you had things like the Black Panther Party for self-defense, right? And so the fact that it had been done before in the United States by Black people was important in terms of giving people in the UK a sense that this was a valid and effective means of dealing with the problems of racism that we were facing, because police were part of the problem. They were not part of the solution.
In Britain, you're saying in Britain that was the case.
Mm-hmm.
So you were suffering discrimination in Britain as well, you were saying.
Yes. I mean, we were dealing with So you had racist violence on the streets, you had the state racism of immigration laws that would divide families and prevent people from joining their families in the UK. You had a disproportionate number of people of color killed in the custody of the police. You had kind of culture of racism. It's a kind of, probably people in the United States aren't aware of the level of oppression that communities of color in the UK have faced over the last few decades. And obviously it's part of a longer history of British colonialism in South Asia, in the Caribbean, in Africa, and so on.
So what brought you to the United States?
So I moved to the United States around 10 years ago to do writing and research about the war on terror, as it was impacting particularly on Muslim communities in the United States. So I was working on a book on that topic, which is a book that came out in 2014 called The Muslims Are Coming. And one of the things that I looked at in that book, which leads us on to Jamil Al-Amin, is a case of a man in Detroit called Luqman Abdullah, who was an imam in the Black Muslim community there and was killed by the FBI in 2009. So in The Muslims Are Coming, it's his story that I opened that book with. And I spent quite a bit of time in Detroit kind of researching what happened. And essentially, the FBI had conjured up the false idea that he was somehow a representative of Al-Qaeda, and that had ended up with them conducting a raid and killing him. And when I looked into why Luqman Abdullah had been targeted by the FBI, it became clear that one of the things that was significant about his story was that he was an associate of Imam Jamil Al-Amin, formerly A. Brown. And so I wrote a little about that in that book. But after the book came out, I kind of started to get more interested in Jamil Al-Amin's story, and I got to know his wife in Atlanta, Karima, a little, and became clear that this was someone who's been entirely forgotten by the United States. He was someone who was a household name in 1968, 1969. He'd be on television programs. He would be someone that was a general reference point. And somehow, in spite of all the kind of revival of interest in Black movements from that period that I think we've seen grow over the last 10 to 20 years, there was nothing on him. You would search in vain on the internet for some decent writing about his story, or you could search the academic databases and find very little. And so I started to wonder if there would be some value in thinking about writing his biography, both as a way to reestablish his contribution in the kind of public consciousness, but also potentially to draw attention to his current incarceration and the miscarriage of justice that led to it.
Fascinating, really. So thanks for all your work on that. What years are we talking about then, when you first started?
Yeah, so I think it would be about 5 years ago now. I started.
5 years ago.
I wrote a piece for The Nation magazine, an interview I did with Karima Al-Amin, his wife.
I see.
I think that was about five or so years ago, and then after that, I started to think about doing a biography. So what that involves is a few different things, right? So you start doing research in the archives that exist, whether that's the archives of the organizations that he was active with, such as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which has very extensive archives in the King Center in Atlanta, or the archives from the government side. I think probably more pages of FBI surveillance of H.Rap Brown, Jamil Al-Amin than any other figure in the history of the FBI. And much of that material is available in one way or another in various archives. So there's that kind of work. There's the work of interviewing people that have worked with Jamil Al-Amin and have known him and have been associated with him in the various periods of his life. But then if you're writing the biography of someone who's still alive, as in this case, obviously the prize is to be able to interview the man himself, who since 2002 has been incarcerated. And so naturally what I did was to go through the formal process that there is to apply to do a media interview with someone in the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. There's a set of forms that you can fill out to make that request, which I did maybe 4 years ago now. That request was pretty quickly rejected.
That was how many years ago? About 4 years ago? You tried to do that?
I think that was actually 2016. I started that process. Yeah, I think or the beginning of 2017, perhaps. So that was rejected. And I was kind of curious as to what their reasoning was, as to why. I mean, I was aware that no one was being allowed to interview him, and no one had interviewed him since he was incarcerated. And so one of the strange things about Jamil Al-Amin's situation is that he is in federal custody, has been in federal custody since 2006, even though his original conviction is in the Georgia state system. And so essentially since 2006, and we can kind of go into the background to this if you want later, but essentially since 2006, he's being held in federal custody in federal prisons on behalf of Georgia state. And so what that means is that when someone like me comes along and says, I want to interview this guy, the Federal Bureau of Prisons consults with the Georgia State Department of Corrections to make that decision. And because Georgia State has better than average freedom of information legislation, one of the things that I was able to do was to put in a request to the Georgia Department of Corrections to see the correspondence about the decision that they had with the Federal Bureau of Prisons, so that I could get some sense of what the reasoning was. So I did that, and I got back a load of material that told me two things. One, in 2002, after his original conviction, two or three of the big broadcasters like CNN and ABC News and so forth had requested to do an interview with him. It was a bit of a news story back then. So those interviews requests came in. They were granted immediately after his conviction. They were granted, but for reasons that I don't know, the interviews never took place. Subsequently, no interview request has been accepted. That's the first thing that comes out from those materials. Second thing is the justification for the denial of access to interview him was the phrase they had was, it's a security risk. So you wonder, well, what is this security risk that you think would be there were a journalist or a writer, someone like me, to go to a Federal Bureau of Prisons, to go to a prison and interview him? Is it that you think that I would be at risk, or do you think that he would be at risk? Or, what is the risk here? And of course, what you understand is that the risk that they perceive, the security risk, is that his words, that they essentially think that him speaking and his words being conveyed to the broader public is in itself a risk, which of course is, when you understand that, you wonder if that's something that could be challenged on First Amendment grounds, as it seems like exactly the kind of thing that the First Amendment to the Constitution is supposed to prevent, the idea that someone can be censored simply because you believe that what they're saying is dangerous. And so I started talking to lawyers about potentially challenging that. I spoke to friends of mine at the ACLU and a few other places. The suggestion that I got back from everyone that I spoke to from a lawyer's point of view was, well, you don't really have any chance of winning a case against the Federal Bureau of Prisons because the precedents that have been established in this area have essentially all given the prison authorities a very wide-ranging discretion for them to decide what they consider to be a security risk and what they consider not to be. And the only thing that legal precedent has established is that every prisoner has the right to write letters to journalists. And so long as those letters can be sent from the prison to a journalist, no other communication is necessary. Now, interestingly, I had been writing letters to Jamil Al-Amin, but those letters were actually being delayed by about 6 months.
Really? 6 months? Okay,
yeah,
go ahead.
So what would happen is that I would write a letter, and because Jamil Al-Amin was in touch by phone with family members occasionally, and I was in touch with those family members, I could ask them to ask him if he'd received the letters, and which they did. And he would tell me, like 6 months further along, he would tell me he hadn't received those letters. So with the United States Postal Service, you can obviously have those letters registered. And then if they don't arrive, you can actually ask the US Postal Service to investigate what's happened to them, which I did, of course. And so what comes back from the US Postal Service is well, the letter was delivered to the prison, but we can't really tell you what's happened to it after that. So what I guess what was happening was that letters were kind of sitting on with someone for 6 months, perhaps while they waited to be read before being passed on to him. But whatever the reasoning was on their part, it was an impractical way to communicate, of course. But so this is back in 2017. The advice I've had from the lawyers I'd spoken to is there's no legal remedy for you. So I then thought, okay, well, let's try, and the law can't help me. Let's try to bring some public pressure of another kind. And so I organized a petition I tried to get the sort of leading academics who work on the history of the civil rights movement, which of course H. Rap Brown was a major figure in. And I had a kind of open letter that a few hundred academics signed, including some very big names, which basically said, look, this guy is a key figure in this history. We need historians to be able to have access to him in prison and interview him before he dies, because he's in his 70s and he's probably going to die in prison. We need to have the ability for historians to interview him so that we don't lose the knowledge that he has about that history that's so important for us to make progress on questions of racism. Like, we can't make progress unless we understand the history. So a few hundred academics signed that, and I then submitted that to the Federal Bureau of Prisons and said, look, this is some very serious and significant figures in the field of the academic disciplines of history that are saying it's crucial for our kind of public conversation to have access to this guy. Please rethink your earlier decision. 24 hours later, they come back again and say, sorry, no. So then I'm stuck. And, I think this is where having a bit of a background as an activist was helpful for me, because you know that you have to keep fighting and you keep pushing. So what would happen is then every 6 months or so, I'd put in another request again, just to see if by some chance they would change their mind, but also just to say, look, I'm not going away. And then eventually last year, I actually started to work with the First Amendment Clinic at Cornell Law School and the First Amendment Clinic at Arizona State University Law School. And those folks disagreed with the legal advice that I'd had earlier. And they said, actually, we do think there's a challenge here that you can do. And so they drew up a 20-page or so legal argument, a legal complaint ready to go. And in January of this year, we sent that to the Federal Bureau of Prisons and basically said, look, we're going to go to a judge with this legal complaint and we think we'll win. And you can read the argument in the complaint and see that it's pretty watertight. Unless you want to negotiate right now, we'll see you in court. And that worked, because they came back and said, okay, we'll negotiate. And the argument that was made was the argument that kind of captured the situation very precisely, which was he is being discriminated against on the basis of his viewpoint. It's viewpoint discrimination. Other people are being interviewed in prisons all the time. What singles him out is that the prison authorities don't want his particular viewpoint to be circulated. So they, I think, understood that were we to go to court, there'd be a good chance of us winning, which would be humiliating for them and also potentially precedent setting for them. So they negotiated. And so given that this was in the midst of the COVID pandemic, what we agreed was that we'd start with some video interviews. And then once things seemed a bit safer in terms of COVID, we would do an in-person interview. And so I did a few hours of video interviews from kind of March to May. And then towards the end of August, I was able to go to the federal prison in Tucson.
Arun, would you explain what do you mean by that, video interviews?
So essentially, he would be taken to a room in the prison where there'd be a video conferencing system that would then connect him to me on my laptop sitting at home. And we would be able to speak via video link for, an hour and a half or so for each of those sessions. One of the things about his experience in the prison over the last couple of years is he has had a cataracts in his eyes. And your listeners are probably aware that cataracts normally is something that's quite easy to fix. It's a relatively straightforward operation, quite quick to do, quite low risk. And most people get that done early on in the process and they don't have any problems with their eyesight. Now, for him in prison and being seen as someone who's being targeted by the authorities in this way, they denied him the operation. So since I'd say at least a year, he basically lost his eyesight and everything was very blurry for him. So on those video interviews, although I was able to see him, he wasn't able to see me because he couldn't see anything. A couple of weeks before the in-person interview in August, I think possibly because of the growing attention that there is now on his case and the fact that more and more people are making their support for him known to the authorities in various ways, that pressure seemed to have led to them thinking that they ought to do the operation on his eyes. And so when I saw him in August in person, his eyesight was fine again. And so, we were both able to see each other.
So what do you mean August in person? So were you at the prison?
Yeah.
I see. And that's when you did an interview with him. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I spent 2 days there.
An in-person interview, I should say.
Yeah, in-person interview. Yeah.
Okay,
yes,
go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. So I spent 2 days there and kind of sat with him for a couple of hours in each of those 2 days. And so I was able to add to the few hours of video interviews that I'd already done with him, 3 hours or so of in-person interviews.
Wonderful. So Arun, tell us how we can proceed with this. Could you tell us about the interview? I mean, what you all were saying and so forth. So Arun, would you please tell us about your interview with Jamil Al-Amin? What a wonderful opportunity for you and for all of us to learn about what he's thinking, what he's doing, and so forth. And I want to thank you for sharing this with us. So I know you haven't shared it yet, but you're going to, right? So tell us about the interview. Oh, let me ask you this as well, Arun. So you recorded all of this. Are you going to be sharing those recordings ultimately or what?
So on the recordings, I have audio recordings, not video,
okay.
audio recordings. So,
okay.
What you have to understand is that there is a negotiation between me and the prison authorities. It's incredibly intricate and complicated because they're still, in spite of their agreement in principle to allowing this to happen, there are many restrictions that they were seeking to impose, right down to very elaborate conversations about what exactly I could bring into the interview.
Oh, really? Did they look at your questions first or anything like that?
No, but they were...
They monitored.
Well, that's hard to know for sure. What it looks like is a conversation that went on for several weeks where with back and forth around what kind of equipment I can bring into the interview and how long the interview can last for and when it can take place and things like that. Now, in terms of and what the interview can be used for, right? So the agreement that ended up was the interview is for the purpose of me writing my book. And so that's one thing. Then I was allowed to bring in 2 audio recorders, one backup to record the interview, in terms of audio, but not video. I wasn't allowed to bring in a video camera, wasn't allowed to bring in my mobile phone, wasn't allowed to take photos. I had insisted that the interview take place in a room where no one else is in the room. And that's what happened. But, in terms of the privacy of the conversation, I think both of us, I think Jamil Al-Amin and I both assumed reasonably that it wasn't a guaranteed private conversation because we're in a federal prison and who knows what monitoring is taking place without us being aware of it. And B, in theory, of course, the audio recordings that I'm making could be subpoenaed by a court or hacked. There's no we couldn't assume that the conversation was private given the circumstances. So now in terms of how that will be used, so the agreement was that I'm not supposed to just now release that audio recording for people to listen to because it's that part of the negotiation was that it has to be for my book. However, some parts of it, I think the family, Jamil Al-Amin's family, I've shared some of it with them, and they may well release it in one form or another at some point.
Okay, excellent.
Because obviously, I do think there is obviously huge value in in people being able to hear his voice.
Exactly.
And what's incredible about him is he has been in solitary confinement. Like, so before in the last few years, he's been in the general population in 2 or 3 different federal prisons. But prior to that, he was in ADX Florence in Colorado for about, if I remember right, it's about 7 years or so. Now, ADX Florence in Colorado is a place where you are buried underground and you are locked up in a small cell for 23 hours a day. And you have no physical interaction with other human beings. And there's psychologists who've studied what it means to do that to another human being. And most of them conclude that after 3 months or so, that you're looking at permanent mental health consequences, as you can expect, because part of what makes it, the thing perhaps that makes us human is our interaction with other human beings. That's definitive of humanity. And take that away and you break someone. Now, in his case, he has, as far as I can see, based on my several hours with him, he is as sharp as ever mentally. And so 7 years of trying to break the man has not succeeded. And if people are familiar with Jamil Al-Amin's speeches, whether in the heyday of the Black Power movement in the late 60s or perhaps more recently since 1971 when he converted to Islam, you will know that the one thing you can say about him is that he is a powerful and inspiring speaker. And that was fully on display in the time that I spent with him. He was able to range across the whole history of movements in the United States that he's lived through. His memory was intact and sharp. I mean, he was able to cite from memory passages of Frantz Fanon or Ibn Khaldun. He even was able to give his opinion on Facebook, which is pretty amazing considering it didn't exist when he was originally incarcerated.
I mean, he's doing that now?
He's not. He was able to give an opinion about social media.
I see.
You won't find him on Facebook, but
okay, all right, that's what I was wondering. Okay, I thought, okay, that's interesting. So, could you share with us some of his thoughts, or some, what he was thinking, or?
Well, I mean, conversation with him was focused on trying to understand his life and his contribution and how he understood what he was trying to do at various points in his life, right? And why he made the decisions he made at different times within the movements that shaped him and that he shaped in turn. So what we talked about was his life, and from his coming up in the 1940s in Louisiana, the influences that shaped him from his family, from the social context at the time, the kind of fear of white supremacist violence that pervaded his upbringing, and how he, one of the interesting things he talks about at that point is as a teenager. So not just understanding that there is this white supremacist terrorism out there that's a threat to your life, but understanding also that there's a little gray area that you can work within, where you can start to, if you know how to navigate that area, you can start to assert yourself and push back against the oppression you're experiencing without risking your life, without putting your life in danger, right? Like, there's a line that you can't cross where you could be killed for it, but there's a space that you can operate in that had opened up perhaps as a result of the struggles through the 1930s and 1940s. Jamil Al-Amin's father was involved in the Baton Rouge bus boycott. So with most of us, I'm sure, are familiar with the Montgomery bus boycott that was led by Martin Luther King and is very familiar to us, I think. But a few years before, there was the bus boycott in Baton Rouge where Trap Brown grew up, and his father was involved in it. And so these were some of the things that were kind of shaping him. And then through his brother Ed Brown, he became involved in the civil rights movement, in particular in SNCC, and he became someone who was active in Alabama and in Mississippi.
Before you go on, I just want our listeners to know that Ed Brown, he passed a few years ago, but he was involved with WRFG. He served on our board. He was also a friend of mine. Before he passed, he gave me the marching orders, Heather, you have to do what you can for my brother. So I wanted to share that as well. Anyway, go ahead, Arun. Thank you. You're listening to the Just Peace program on WRFG Atlanta 89.3 FM And we will now return to our discussion with Arun Kundnani about Jamil Al-Amin.
Right. And so, Ed Brown was the older brother and was kind of groomed in their family to have a kind of leadership role, right? And whereas his younger brother, H. Rap Brown, was perhaps more of a street kid and more of someone who was kind of less about being respectable and being responsible as a leader and more about pushing the boundaries, right? And so he kind of becomes prominent in SNCC with that reputation. His nickname of Rap Brown comes from his skills as a street corner rhymer, what used to be called signifying, kind of street battles with rhymes. And what we now call rap, actually as a result of the fact that H. Rap Brown was called rap. So when we talk about rap music today, that the origin of that term comes actually from H. Rap Brown, which is something I think is little known.
That's interesting. So would really like to know some of what you all were discussing. I mean, you've told us a little bit, but I'm sure it was just a wonderful, wonderful experience, actually. How do we proceed with that?
Because the conversation was me trying to piece together his life story and how he understood what he was doing at each point in his life. Telling you what we talked about is essentially telling you his life story.
Then he was telling you his story. That's wonderful. That's great.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, essentially that's what we were doing. I'm trying to write his biography.
Okay, that's wonderful. What was it that about the interview with him that, I know we can't go into all of what you all were discussing, but what was particularly impressive for you? I guess you've shared some of that, but what else?
One of the really striking things is that he's funny. And this is something that people kind of mentioned to me over the years that I've been interested in his life. But to experience it in person is pretty striking, especially when you're in this it's a very strange situation to be in, to be sat in this kind of blank room inside a federal prison. With the other side of the door, there's a corrections officer. And we haven't met each other in person before. We can't assume that we can talk freely. So it's a very odd situation to be in. And for him, in his circumstances, to be able to deal with it with humor is... and then also there's this kind of modesty to him. He's, I think, absolutely always been clear in his life that the movement is not about any one individual, right? And whatever his contribution, it's as a vehicle for bigger forces, not as an expression of his own kind of individual greatness. And that's something that comes across in small ways. Like very striking to me when we'd finished speaking, he asked me if there's anything he can do for me. And I'm thinking, well, it's surely meant to be the other way around. You're the one who's locked up. But that's his personality. He's got a very strong sense of generosity that many people speak about. And the other part of this, which didn't come across immediately from the conversation I had with him, but that many other people talk about, is one of the things that I keep hearing people say about him is that never has the movement produced a braver figure. Right. And I think there's something about when you think about that moment in which he becomes prominent as a national figure in 1967 or so, you think about who are the comparable figures from that period and what happened to them. However you draw up that list, everyone on it except him was either killed or forced into exile or co-opted in some way, right? Or if not co-opted, at least pacified through perhaps becoming an academic or something like that. Mm-hmm. I mean, he's the only one who, from that period with that prominence, who actually has stayed, I think, outside of any of those categories. He did leave the country briefly in 1970. In 1970, there was a car bomb that went off in Maryland and killed two of Rap's associates, Che Payne and Ralph Featherston. And the bomb was clearly intended for H. Rap Brown because it was his car. He just happened not to be in it at the time. And he was about to appear in court in Maryland at that time. And so after that, he went underground and he spent some of the time over the next 18 months outside the United States. He traveled in, as he puts it, he traveled around the world without a passport because he was kind of in hiding. and he was put on the FBI's most wanted list. The CIA had kind of sent instructions to all its offices around the world to try and track him down, but he was never identified. He was able to evade capture, and he was in Egypt, where he met figures from the PLO. He was in Tanzania, where a lot of other SNCC folks were at that time. But eventually unlike a lot of the Panthers and a lot of the other folks in SNCC, some of whom stayed in Africa, he felt that for him, the struggle was back in the United States. So he did come back to the United States. And I think that's unusual.
Yes, that's just absolutely fascinating. So did you talk at all about what happened in Atlanta, what he was put into prison for? Did you have that discussion?
Right. So because that is subject to ongoing legal, although he's exhausted, I think, the formal appeals process, there is a quasi-legal process still ongoing with the Conviction Integrity Unit in Atlanta, in the prosecutor's office, potentially looking at his case.
Exactly.
So there is so for that reason, I had to treat it as a live legal matter. And what that means is, I think the advice from lawyers would be, you have to be very careful about what kind of conversation you get into with him on the specifics of what happened in regards to that conviction, because essentially what you're doing is interviewing him without a lawyer present. And the material that you have recorded in that interview is something that potentially could be obtained by people who then use it out of context.
No, I understand.
So I was quite cautious about going into the specifics of what happened, although we did talk about it a little. And
I do want to mention one thing about this that I think a lot of people don't quite understand is that Jamil was involved with some organizing work in Alabama, developing the community, an Islamic community in Alabama. And that's why after this, Ricky Kinchin was killed here in Atlanta, the policeman, right? Jamil was headed to Alabama to do some of that organizing work, and people didn't really quite understand that. I've talked to some people in Atlanta who said he was trying to escape, and that simply was not the case from everything that I've learned about this. So I don't know if you want to say anything about that as well.
I would say a couple of things on the case, right? So one is, if you look at, let me put it this way, right? Sometimes there's a particular, this is a complicated case. There's all kinds of strands to it, and we can go into lots of detail on all the different strands to it. But sometimes there's just one piece to a case that reveals the bigger picture. And to me, that is true of this case. And the one piece that I think does that is if you look at the identification evidence that supposedly places Jamil Al-Amin as the shooter. That evidence comes from the surviving officer, right, who says that, so after the incident, the shooter gives a statement that says, the surviving officer gives a statement that says the shooter was someone with grayish eyes and the height is estimated at something like 5'6" or something like that, right? So two key pieces of identification have no correspondence to Jamil Al-Amin, right, who is way over 6 foot and has darker eyes, right? So the identification doesn't match, right? Now, okay, so if you're the prosecutor, you might say, all right, the identification evidence isn't great, but then this guy's, just been involved in the shootout, so maybe he's not being as accurate as he thinks he was, and we can account for it. But then here's the kind of decisive thing. We find out later that the description the surviving officer gives of the shooter exactly corresponds to an inaccurate description in Jamil Al-Amin's police file at the police department. So in other words, the only way you can explain that is that after the incident, the surviving officer checks what the description of Jamil Al-Amin is from the police file and then adjusts his testimony to match that description, which only later turns out that was an inaccurate description because of whatever police incompetence led to the inaccuracies in their files, right?
So that's interesting.
So that, to me, that's the giveaway, right? That's the giveaway, because what that tells us, without doubt, is that there is an attempt, at least on the part of one officer, to tamper with evidence, to attribute this crime to Jamil Al-Amin, right? Now, once you accept that, I think everything else starts to follow that basically brings the prosecutor's case crashing down. And, obviously the other overwhelming piece of evidence is the fact that we have someone else who's confessed to the crime under oath repeatedly over decades now. And that evidence was not brought before the jury. We have the police officer in Alabama who testifies that the gun that supposedly was found near Jamil Al-Amin was planted, in his words, right? So piece after piece, we start to get an account that suggests that there was a deliberate attempt to pin this crime on Jamil Al-Amin when someone else is obviously the perpetrator. And what the jury were not allowed to have access to was the core argument in Jamil Al-Amin's defense, which is who he is, right? What his history is. The fact that since the mid-1960s, he's been the target of the FBI, repeatedly trying to criminalize him. He's been shot at 4 times in his life. This is a part of that ongoing targeting that has been happening to him since he emerged in the mid-60s as a leader.
Why do you think that Jamil Al-Amin is such a threat to the FBI or to the security system?
Right. Well, I think we can go back to the original secret memos, right, to get an understanding of that, right? So he is one of the 5 people named in the infamous August 1967 memo, the so-called COINTELPRO memo. COINTELPRO stands for Counterintelligence Program. This was the memo coming from J. Edgar Hoover's office in Washington at the FBI, sent to all the field offices around the United States. And what it was doing was instructing the entire FBI to attempt to neutralize, to use their term, neutralize Black radical politics. And under that category would be included Martin Luther King, as well as H. Rap Brown, right? So if you study, as I've done, these files in detail, thousands and thousands of files from the FBI at that time on this. If you study that, their reasoning is this. At that time, their reasoning is, and this is the reasoning that Lyndon Baines Johnson shares in the White House as well, by the way, which is they cannot imagine that there might be a Black insurgency taking place in the United States against white supremacy, against capitalism, against the Vietnam War, which is what we're talking about in 1967. That can't be happening because these are genuine issues and genuine grievances leading to an authentic movement coming from the masses of Black people in the United States. That is something that they just won't confront as a possibility. So instead, they have to be able to explain this movement in some other way. And so what they do is they say, well, the only reason, according to them, that Black people are involved in protest and so forth is because they've been manipulated into doing so by a small number of charismatic leaders, such as H. Rap Brown. And why are those leaders doing that manipulation? Well, there must be behind them some kind of communist party pulling the strings, right? So this whole way of thinking essentially removes any agency from Black people themselves and makes them the puppets of either the Soviet Union or China, right? And the debate within the FBI at the time is which of those two is it? And they have this vast, elaborate surveillance operation, desperately trying to find some evidence that can link the Black Power movement back to Moscow or Beijing, which of course they never find, because that's a really bad way of understanding what that movement was.
Fascinating.
So that's, from their point of view, in that period in the 60s and 70s, it's two things. It's the kind of the inability psychologically to come to terms with what the Black movement represents as a challenge to the United States, right? And therefore the attempt to find some other explanation, which becomes folded into the question of the Cold War with communism. Now, then, after the end of the Cold War, to put it very mechanically and simply, Islam replaces communism as the new kind of organizing threat for security policies. So what we see then is a similar kind of set of reasoning, but instead of communism, it's the question of Islam, and instead of Moscow, it's radical Islamists from the Middle East, and that become the kind of way that this is all framed. And because Jamil Al-Amin has converted to Islam in 1971 and subsequently through the 80s and 90s becomes one of the most prominent American Muslim leaders, so that by the 90s, when Cold War is over and Islam is emerging with this new kind of narrative of threat, he once again becomes targeted as a kind of vector of Islamic radicalism. That's why he's probably the most surveilled person in the history of the FBI, is because not only is he in the top tier of targets through that period in the 60s and 70s, when it's about the Black freedom movement, but and the Black Power movement, understood within the context of the Cold War, but then also in the 90s and afterwards, framed within the idea of Muslim radicalization, right? So even after he's incarcerated in 2002 in the Georgia state prison system, they're still writing reports and memos and doing surveillance on him in the prison system. So that in 2006, there's a report that the FBI does on the Muslim radicalization in Georgia state prison system, which identifies him as the threat, even though, and if you read the report, it's clear that there's absolutely no basis for it. But again, that rather than address the issue of Black prisoners in Georgia state prison system who have a whole set of grievances that need to be addressed, and the fact that they are mobilizing in prisons and organizing to challenge the authorities around those grievances, rather than deal with that issue, it's so much easier to say, okay, we can just blame it all on this one guy who we already have a history of targeting, and we will now remove him from the Georgia state prison system and bury him underground in a federal prison.
That's a fascinating analysis. Hi, Ernest. I'm curious to know your interpretation of that analysis of Islam and so forth in the United States. You want to add anything to that?
No, not at all, because I think that's a very thorough analysis of the situation. And I think very much the first one that I've heard, not that spoke so much about the Islam, but all the ins and outs concerning the case that I didn't understand or know about, has been very helpful. And it has also been very helpful in understanding how we must go ahead in the future in order to preserve our thinkers and those that help to mobilize action, so that they don't get caught in the web that our brother El-Amin is caught in. And I want to thank him so much. Thank you so much, sir, for your analysis and the perseverance that you have shown in getting to speak to him. I can't say anything more than thank you again, and it has been an education also. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ernest. So Arun, I know our time is just going here quickly, but as Dr. King would say, where do we go from here? So, you did this incredible interview. So what happens now?
Right. Well, I have some work to do now in writing this book and try and tell this story and hopefully do it some justice. And in the meantime, we have ongoing work to do to campaign for Jamil Al-Amin to be transferred to somewhere nearer to his family and supporters in Georgia, to try and engage with the Conviction Integrity Unit to try and get the case looked at again by them, which, I'm not a lawyer, but I understand that they might not have the power to overturn the conviction, but they certainly have the power to call for his release. And I think, Heather, perhaps you know more about the events that are upcoming in Atlanta to support all of that. And as Ernest said, I think by doing that kind of work of trying to support Jamil Al-Amin in his current situation, we are sending a message that we will defend the people that stand up for our rights, and that they can't just be targeted in this way, because if they do that to him, then we all are being targeted. Exactly.
So
the avenue that you were able to open in order to see him, that president, which is the president in his case, is that avenue still open for others to reach him, family and for his voice to be again heard by people?
Yeah, I understand what you mean. Yeah, I mean, so before COVID, of course, it was possible for his family and people who knew him before he was incarcerated for them to visit him. Now, what it seems to me has happened in the last year or so is that they have used the existence of COVID as an excuse to single him out and block his visitors. Some of his family members have actually been to Tucson and have wanted to visit him and have been turned away. And the excuse given was the COVID risk, even though other people in the prison have visitors. And so it doesn't seem to be a general principle. It seems to be a specific rule they've made up just for him. Now, hopefully that will be changing, and the more public pressure we bring, the better, because that's obviously outrageous. And there's nothing to stop anyone who's a journalist or an academic or anyone who wants to from approaching the Federal Bureau of Prisons and saying that you want to interview him, right? If they've allowed me to do it, it's hard. It seems to me it's hard for them to deny the right to anyone else. And if they say no, then, again, it's a matter of bringing the pressure to force them to change their decision. So hopefully there'll be a lot more opportunities to hear his voice now.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you, Arun. So now, just before we go here, I'm just curious. So you've had this interview, and I just want to go back again to what you're going to do with it exactly. I mean, you're going to be analyzing it, transcribing it, and using it in your book and so forth. But again, are you going to reveal any of this, the sound of the interview itself, or
well, so I'm gonna let the family figure that out.
That's okay. Good for you.
I've shared some of that material with them,
okay.
So they have some of that material. So it's up to them to decide what they want to do with that and how they want to use that. And so watch this space, I think, in terms of how they go ahead with that.
Are you planning on interviewing him again?
I feel like I've got everything I need to do the work I need to do.
And how long was the interview?
So this year I've had about 6 or so hours of talking time with him.
Excellent.
So I feel like that's enough for what I need to do. Like, all the questions I had have been answered. And obviously I've had that time with him, having spent a few years doing research in archives, and with, I've done about 30 or 40 interviews with other people that have worked with him. So I have a whole load of material supplementing the time I have with him. So I've got more than enough to be working with to write the book I want to write. But that's obviously not the last. I mean, there's every reason for him to be interviewed for other people's projects. Like, other people might be more interested in having him talk about his case, or having him talk about his current circumstances, perhaps more than I would have done. So, and I think that he's such a significant figure, even though he's been largely forgotten in the mainstream consciousness. He's such a significant figure that I think over time there'll be more and more interest in his life. And I don't think I'll be the last person to write a book about him. So,
all right,
which is great. I mean, I don't want exclusive rights to telling his story. I'm glad that there'll be others.
So, Arun, I want to thank you so much for sharing all this with us this evening. It's just wonderful. Thank you. And thanks for your great work.
Thanks for having me, Heather.
When can we expect your book to come out?
Well, that's
the question, right?
That's the question. I mean, I don't want to answer that question really, because it's one of those things that's very difficult to say. But I'm going to be working on it over the coming months. My best guess, if you know a little about how, books are slow things to get out, because even when you've written the first draft of the manuscript, as you know, Heather, there's a whole process that can take about a year after that before it's in the hands of readers as a printed book. So my guess is that we're looking at 2 years or so, but we'll see.
Okay, so just before we end this, though, I would appreciate if you could share with us what, in your opinion, is so incredibly significant about Jamil Al-Amin and what we should learn from him, just quickly. I know that's asking a lot, but what to you is so significant about him?
I mean, I think his life story does a number of things when we think about it, right? So one of them is that it enables us to see continuities between then and now, right, that are not possible to see through anyone else that you might think of alongside him, right? So because he is someone who has been targeted in the post-Cold War period that's focused on Islam, and someone who's in a struggle now, in a prison now, it means that the history of the Black Power movement in the late 60s and early 70s that we're kind of increasingly interested in and kind of see as a kind of key moment. It's not something that's just in the past, it's with us now. And that's what comes out through his life. And that's a testament to his personality and his persistence as a leader of his people, and his kind of commitment to constantly trying to rethink what works and what doesn't work, and not kind of get stuck in the old ways of doing things when it turns out that they have not proven successful. And kind of mirroring that through his life, we get to see how do authorities respond when they are challenged, right? What are the methods they use to try and respond to mass movements coming up from marginalized groups to assert their rights, right? And so there's a lesson there, and that's something that again runs right through his life and that is documented in thousands and thousands of pages of government memos. And I think at the end of the day, we're living in a time of upheaval and insurgency, right? Like we had, I think the estimate is 12 million people on the streets of the United States last summer in the Black Lives Matter protests in the midst of a pandemic. Old certainties are being thrown up in the air. We are living through a period that in some ways we haven't seen this upheaval since the late 1960s. And so I think, the last period in which there was a revolutionary movement in the United States was the kind of movement that Jamil Al-Amin was involved in the late 60s, right? That's the last time something like that came up. And so I think through his life, we can kind of bridge back to that period and use that period to understand what we're living through today and how we might tackle these deep political challenges that we face today around racism, but also around, he was as interested and focused on the question of national liberation in Africa, in Palestine, in Puerto Rico, as he was engaged on issues of Black liberation within the United States mainland. And in that sense, he's an internationalist, and there is no politics today unless it's an internationalist politics. Like the challenges we face today have to be tackled at the international level. Like unless we are all safe from COVID in the whole world, none of us are safe from COVID. Unless we're all dealing with climate change in the world, none of us are effectively dealing with climate change, right? We're in an age when only the international solutions work. And it seems to me Jamil Al-Amin, H.R. Brown, is one of the kind of figures who represents a tradition of Black internationalism in the United States very powerfully. And then finally, he's, unlike some of his contemporaries, he's someone who was able and is able to communicate in a way that ordinary people can understand, right? He's not someone that is over intellectualizing. He's able to talk in the language of the street, like he's chatting to you on that street corner in the vernacular of ordinary people. And that's very unusual for someone of his prominence and importance, and I think speaks to something very radically democratic about him and his politics that I think we have lost sight of a lot nowadays.
Well, Arun Kundnani, I want to thank you so much for sharing all this. Thank you. Thanks for your great work.
Thank you very much, Arun. That was wonderful, needed, and inspiring to keep those of us that may be feeling that there's no hope. Mm-hmm. And thank you, because that's the most important thing, is not to lose hope and not
Absolutely.
To stop struggling.
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Heather.
I'm going to ask everyone to stay tuned for Revolutionary African Perspectives.
Thank you.